The smell of garlic and truffle oil filled the air at Bellini's, an upscale Italian restaurant tucked away in the heart of downtown Chicago. Crystal glasses sparkled under soft lighting, and the gentle clink of silverware against fine china created a peaceful backdrop to the hushed conversations of wealthy patrons. In the midst of this elegant chaos moved Annie, her dark hair pulled back in a neat bun, her uniform crisp despite having been on her feet for nearly 10 hours. She balanced 3 plates along her arm with the precision that came from years of practice. "Here we are," she said with a genuine smile as she set down a plate of mushroom risotto. "Anything else I can get for you?" The businessman barely looked up from his phone, giving her a dismissive wave. Annie nodded politely and moved on to her next table, her smile never faltering. At 26, she had learned that genuine kindness was rarely returned in kind, but she offered it anyway. Tonight was different. From most nights at Bellini's, the main dining area had been reserved for a private event. Some big shots from the tech industry were celebrating a successful merger. The restaurant manager had pulled the staff aside before opening, his voice tense with worry. "These people can make or break us with a single review online," he'd warned. "So whatever they want, they get. Understand?" Everyone had nodded, but Annie had been working at Bellini's for 3 years now. She knew the drill. The rich were just people too, some nice, some not so nice. As she refilled water glasses, her eyes drifted to the grand piano that sat in the corner of the room. It was mostly for show, played only on special occasions by hired musicians. Tonight it sat silent, its polished surface reflecting the chandelier light. Something tugged at Annie's heart when she looked at it, a familiar ache she had learned to ignore. "Hey, table 12 needs more bread," called out Mia, another waitress rushing past with a tray of drinks. Annie nodded, tearing her gaze away from the piano. That was another life, another time. She had bills to pay and a sick mother to care for. Dreams were luxury items she couldn't afford anymore. The private party was getting louder as the night progressed and more wine was poured. Men in expensive suits laughed too loudly at jokes that weren't funny. Women in designer dresses picked at their food and checked their reflections in compact mirrors. And then he walked in. Alexander Reed didn't look like most of the tech executives Annie had served before. There was no slick haircut or flashy watch. Instead, he wore a simple dark gray suit that looked like it cost more than Annie's monthly rent. His salt and pepper hair slightly tousled, as if he'd been running his hands through it. He moved with quiet confidence, and the room seemed to shift around him as he entered. Annie had seen his face on magazine covers. Everyone knew Alexander Reed, the man who had built a tech empire from his college dorm room and was now worth billions. Unlike many of his peers, he rarely appeared at public events, making his presence tonight all the more notable. The manager rushed forward, nearly tripping over himself to greet Reed personally. Annie watched as he was led to the head table where the other executives rose to shake his hand. "That's your section now," Mia whispered, appearing beside Annie. "Lucky you. I heard he once left a $20,000 tip at a restaurant in New York." Annie raised an eyebrow. "And I heard he made his assistant cry because she bought the wrong brand of sparkling water." "Well, good luck either way," Mia said with a grin. "Try not to spill anything on his $1,000,000 suit." Annie approached the table with professional composure, notepad in hand. "Good evening, gentlemen, ladies. Can I get you something to drink?" The executives placed their orders. Expensive wines, craft cocktails, top-shelf whiskeys. When she came to Reed, he looked up at her with startling blue eyes. "Just water, please. Sparkling if you have it." His voice was quieter than she expected, with a slight rasp to it. "Of course, sir," she replied, jotting it down. As she turned to leave, she caught him watching her with an odd expression. Not the leering look she sometimes got from drunk businessmen, but something more puzzled, as if trying to solve a riddle. The night progressed, and Annie moved efficiently between tables. Every time she approached the executive's table, she noticed Reed watching her. It made her nervous, though she couldn't pinpoint why. During her third trip to their table, she nearly bumped into another server, causing her to stumble slightly. The executives hardly noticed, deep in conversation about market shares and quarterly reports, all except Reed, whose eyes followed her recovery with that same curious expression. As she delivered their main courses, Annie couldn't help glancing at the piano again. It had been her companion for so many years, the one constant in a life of uncertainty. From age 5 until 19, she had played every day. Her fingers sometimes still moved in her sleep, playing phantom pieces on invisible keys. "You're interested in the piano?" Reed's voice startled her. He had caught her looking. Annie felt heat rise to her cheeks. "Oh, it's a beautiful instrument. Do you play?" he asked. Several of the other executives turned to look at her now, their expressions ranging from mild amusement to open disdain. Who was this waitress to interrupt their important conversations? "I used to," she said simply, then quickly changed the subject. "Can I get you anything else with your meals?" The moment passed and conversation resumed. Annie retreated to the kitchen, her heart beating too fast. She busied herself helping the other servers, trying to ignore the feeling of being watched. By 11, most of the regular diners had left, but the executive party showed no signs of winding down. Annie's feet ached in her sensible black shoes, and she longed to sit down, even for just a minute. She leaned against the wall near the kitchen, giving herself a moment's rest. "You look tired," came a voice beside her. Annie straightened immediately, embarrassed to be caught taking a break. Alexander Reed stood there holding his empty water glass. "I'm sorry, sir. Did you need a refill?" she asked, reaching for the glass. He handed it to her but didn't move away. "How long have you been on shift today?" The question caught her off guard. "Since 10 this morning, sir." 12 hours, he said, more to himself than to her. "And you're still smiling?" Annie didn't know how to respond. Most customers never notice the staff as actual people. "It's my job," she finally said. Reed nodded, studying her face. "Earlier you said you used to play the piano. What happened?" The question felt too personal, but something about his direct gaze made her answer honestly. "Life happened. College is expensive. Medical bills are worse." A flicker of something, understanding perhaps, crossed his face. Before he could respond, one of the executives called him back to the table. With a slight nod to Annie, he returned to his colleagues. As the night wore on, more executives left until only a handful remained, including Reed. Annie began clearing empty tables, setting up for the next day. The piano stood silent in the corner, and each time she passed it, she felt that familiar pull. During one such pass, she paused, allowing her fingers to hover just above the keys without touching them. How long had it been since she'd actually played? 2 years? 3? "Why don't you play something?" Annie jumped, pulling her hand back as if burned. Reed stood nearby, watching her with that same curious expression. "I couldn't," she said quickly. "I'm working. Your manager is in the back counting receipts. The other servers have gone home. It's just us and my increasingly drunk associates," Reed said, gesturing to the 3 remaining executives who were arguing loudly about golf handicaps. Annie shook her head. "I haven't played in years." "I'd be terrible." "I doubt that," Reed said. There was something challenging in his voice now. Some things stay in the fingers, in the muscle memory. "I'd bet you're still good." "It's not appropriate," Annie insisted. "I should finish closing up." Reed studied her for a long moment, then pulled out his wallet. He extracted a business card and held it out to her. "If you ever decide to play again, professionally I mean, call this number." Annie took the card reflexively, confusion written across her face. "I don't understand." "I invest in talent," he said simply, "and people who work 12-hour shifts without losing their smile have something special." With that, he returned to his associates, leaving Annie staring at the embossed card in her hand. She slipped it into her pocket, unsure what to make of the strange encounter. As she continued cleaning tables, she found herself humming softly, a Chopin nocturne she had loved as a teenager. For the first time in years, her fingers itched to play. Maybe someday, she thought. Maybe. The evening finally wound down. The executives paid their enormous bill, leaving a generous but not exceptional tip. As they gathered their coats, Reed approached Annie one last time. "The piano will be waiting," he said cryptically. Then he was gone, following his associates into the cold Chicago night. Annie finished her closing duties, counting her tips and saying goodnight to the kitchen staff. As she waited for the bus in the chilly autumn air, she pulled out Reed's business card again, running her thumb over the raised lettering. Life had a way of taking unexpected turns. 3 years ago, she never would have imagined herself here, exhausted after a long shift, dreams shelved in favor of survival. Yet something about tonight felt like a shift, a small crack in the wall she had built between her past and present. The bus arrived, its doors hissing open. Annie tucked the card safely back into her pocket and stepped aboard, wondering what tomorrow might bring. A week passed, and Annie had almost forgotten about her strange encounter with Alexander Reed. The business card he'd given her sat in her bedside drawer, tucked under a novel she'd been trying to finish for months. Life continued its usual rhythm. Wake up, help Mom with her morning medication, rush to class, then head straight to Bellini's for the evening shift. Tonight was Thursday, typically a slower night at the restaurant. Annie tied her apron with practiced movements as she listened to the manager's evening briefing. "We've got a private event coming in at 8, he announced, checking his clipboard. Some tech company celebration in the main dining room. Annie felt a flutter of something, anticipation maybe, but dismissed it quickly. Chicago was full of tech companies. The chances of seeing Reed again were slim to none. She went about her pre-shift duties, filling salt shakers and folding napkins into perfect triangles. Mia worked beside her, chatting about a date she'd had the night before. "He took me to that new sushi place on Michigan Avenue," Mia said, her hands moving automatically as she polished silverware. "Spent the whole time talking about his fantasy football league." Annie laughed. "At least you got good sushi out of it." "True," Mia conceded with a grin. "What about you? Any interesting customers lately?" For a moment, Annie considered mentioning Reed, but something held her back. That brief interaction felt private somehow, like a secret she wasn't ready to share. "Just the usual," she said with a shrug. The first dinner guests began to arrive, and Annie fell into the familiar rhythm of service. Greet, recommend, serve, check back, clear, repeat. The movement through the restaurant was like a dance she'd performed countless times before. At precisely 8 o'clock, the private party began to arrive. Annie was stationed in a different section tonight, handling a family celebration at the far end of the restaurant. From her position, she could see the main dining area filling with well-dressed people carrying champagne flutes. She tried not to look, forcing herself to focus on her own tables. But during a trip to the kitchen, she caught a glimpse of him, Alexander Reed, shaking hands with the restaurant owner. He looked the same as before, understated elegance, that slightly tousled hair, standing slightly apart from the crowd even while in the middle of it. "Table 9 needs their check," the head server called to her, breaking her reverie. The night progressed, and Annie managed to put Reed out of her mind. Her section was busy enough to keep her fully occupied, running between tables with barely a moment to catch her breath. It wasn't until nearly 10 o'clock, when things began to slow down, that she allowed herself to glance toward the main dining area again. The piano, which usually sat untouched, had been moved to a more central position. A small space had been cleared around it, and the crowd seemed to be waiting for something. Annie paused, tray in hand, watching with curiosity. The restaurant owner stepped forward, tapping a spoon against his glass for attention. "Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Reed has requested some entertainment for the evening. Our pianist was scheduled to arrive at 9, but unfortunately—" "Actually," Reed interrupted, standing up from his table, "I had something else in mind." The crowd turned to him expectantly. Reed's eyes scanned the restaurant until they landed on Annie, who stood frozen near the kitchen door. "I believe you have an employee who plays," he said to the owner, his eyes never leaving Annie's face. A hush fell over the restaurant. The owner looked confused, turning to follow Reed's gaze. "Annie, I wasn't aware—" All heads turned toward her. Annie felt her cheeks burn as she clutched her serving tray like a shield. "I don't," she said quickly. "I mean, I used to, but it's been years." Reed stepped away from his table, approaching her with that same intent expression he'd worn a week ago. "I don't believe talent like that just disappears," he said, his voice carrying in the suddenly quiet restaurant. Annie's manager appeared at her side, looking between her and Reed with wide eyes. "You play piano?" he whispered. "I did," Annie admitted. "A long time ago." Reed was standing before her now. Up close, she could see the faint lines around his eyes, the slight dimple in his right cheek when he spoke. "I have a proposition for you," he said, loud enough for nearby tables to hear. Annie swallowed hard. The weight of dozens of eyes on her made her want to retreat to the kitchen, but something in Reed's gaze held her in place. "Play something," he said. "Anything at all. If you impress me, I'll leave you a tip that equals your yearly salary." Gasps and murmurs rippled through the crowd. Annie's manager stared at Reed, then back at Annie, his expression a mixture of shock and hope. "That's ridiculous," Annie said, her voice barely audible. Is it? Reed raised an eyebrow. Consider it an investment. He gestured toward the piano. One piece. That's all. Annie felt rooted to the spot. Her heart hammered in her chest as memories flooded back. Recitals, competitions, late nights practicing until her fingers cramped. Then later memories. Hospital waiting rooms, scholarship rejection letters, pawn shop receipts. I can't, she whispered. Mia appeared at her side, taking the tray from her trembling hands. Yes, you can, she said softly. What have you got to lose? Annie looked around at the expectant faces, at Reed's challenging expression, at her manager's hopeful one. The piano seemed to beckon from across the room, its polished surface gleaming under the chandelier lights. One piece? She asked finally. Reed nodded. One piece. She took a deep breath, wiping her palms on her apron. Okay. A path cleared for her as she walked slowly toward the piano. The clicking of her sensible work shoes on the hardwood floor seemed unnaturally loud in the silent restaurant. When she reached the bench, she hesitated, suddenly aware of her waitress uniform, her hair falling loose from its bun after hours of work. She sat down anyway, adjusting the bench with practiced movements that her body remembered even after all these years. The keys looked exactly as they always had, alternating black and white, waiting patiently for her touch. Annie placed her hands on the keys, surprised by how natural it felt, like greeting an old friend. She closed her eyes for a moment, deciding what to play. A classical piece would show technique, but something more modern might be more accessible to this audience. Before she could second-guess herself, she began to play. Her fingers found the opening notes of Debussy's Clair de Lune, a piece she had played countless times before. The first notes were tentative, slightly uneven after years without practice, but as the familiar melody unfolded, something awakened inside her. Muscle memory took over, her hands remembering what her mind had forgotten. The gentle, flowing notes filled the restaurant, washing over the silent crowd. Annie kept her eyes on her hands, too nervous to look at the faces watching her. She poured everything into the music, her struggles, her abandoned dreams, the weight of responsibilities that had pulled her away from this joy. Her body swayed slightly as she played, falling back into old habits. As she reached the middle section, her confidence grew. The piece became stronger, more assured. She dared to add her own subtle interpretations. A slight pause here, a gentle emphasis there. This was who she had been before life intervened. Not just someone who played piano, but someone who lived through it. She was so absorbed in the music that she didn't notice the tears streaming down her cheeks, didn't see the mesmerized expressions on the faces around her. For these few minutes, there was only Annie and the piano, reconnecting after a too long absence. When the final notes faded away, she sat still, hands hovering over the keys, afraid to break the spell. Then reality crashed back as thunderous applause erupted around her. Annie opened her eyes, startled by the reaction. Every person in the restaurant was on their feet, applauding. Some were wiping away tears, others were shaking their heads in disbelief. Mia stood near the kitchen, hands pressed to her mouth, eyes wide. And Reed, Alexander Reed, was still seated, his expression unreadable. When their eyes met across the room, he slowly stood and joined the applause. Annie rose shakily from the bench, unsure what to do. She gave an awkward little bow, feeling out of place in her server's uniform. The owner rushed forward, taking her hand and raising it as if announcing a champion. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced over the continuing applause, "our very own Annie." The applause continued as Annie made her way back toward the kitchen, her cheeks burning with embarrassment and something else. Pride, perhaps. As she passed Reed's table, he reached out and touched her arm lightly. "Tomorrow," he said quietly. 10 a.m. my office. He pressed a piece of paper into her hand. "The address. Don't be late." Before she could respond, he was surrounded by his associates, all talking excitedly about what they'd just witnessed. Annie retreated to the kitchen, clutching the paper in her hand. Mia rushed to her side. "Annie, that was incredible. Why didn't you ever say anything? You played like a professional." Annie shook her head, still dazed by what had just happened. "I used to be," she said softly. "A long time ago." Her manager approached, beaming. "Take the rest of the night off," he said. "Whatever Reed is planning, you don't want to miss it. Trust me." Annie nodded, untying her apron with trembling hands. As she gathered her things and prepared to leave, she glanced one more time at the piano. For years she had walked past it, pretending not to see, pretending not to care. Now it had brought her back to life in ways she hadn't thought possible. Outside, the cool night air helped clear her head. She looked down at the address in her hand, wondering what tomorrow would bring. For the first time in years, she felt a flicker of something she'd almost forgotten: hope. Annie barely slept that night. Each time she closed her eyes, she heard the music again, felt the keys beneath her fingers, saw the stunned faces of the restaurant patrons. By the time dawn broke, she had convinced herself that the whole thing had been a dream, that there was no way Alexander Reed, billionaire tech mogul, had challenged her to play piano and then invited her to his office. But the small piece of paper with an address scribbled on it proved otherwise. She sat at her tiny kitchen table, nursing a cup of tea and staring at the paper. The address was in the financial district, in one of those gleaming glass towers that Annie passed on the bus but never entered. What could Reed possibly want with her? "You're up early," came a soft voice. Annie looked up to see her mother standing in the doorway, leaning on her cane. Patricia Jensen moved slowly these days, her body weakened by years of illness, but her eyes were as sharp and kind as ever. "Mom, you should be resting," Annie said, jumping up to help her to a chair. Patricia waved away her concern. "I've rested enough. Tell me what's keeping you awake at 5 in the morning." Annie hesitated, then pushed the piece of paper across the table. "Something happened at work last night." As Patricia listened to the story, her expression shifted from surprise to pride. When Annie finished, her mother reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "You're going, right?" she asked. Annie shrugged. "I don't know. It's probably nothing. Maybe he just wants me to play at another event or something." "Or maybe," Patricia said gently, "it's the chance you've been waiting for." "Mom, I gave up on those chances a long time ago," Annie said, her voice tight. "I'm a waitress now, not a pianist." "You're both," her mother insisted. "You always have been." She tapped the paper with her finger. "Just hear what the man has to say." Annie looked at the clock, 5:30 a.m. Hours to go before the meeting if she decided to go at all. Her Thursday morning class would be starting at 9, which meant she'd have to skip it to make the appointment. "I can't miss class," she said, grasping at excuses. "And someone needs to be here with you." "Mrs. Patel from next door already checks on me Thursday mornings when you're at class," Patricia reminded her. "And you've never missed a day. One class won't kill you." Annie stood and began pacing the small kitchen. "But what would I even wear? I can't show up at a fancy office building in jeans." Patricia smiled knowingly. "The black dress you wore to your cousin's wedding last year. It's simple but nice." "It's probably too fancy," Annie protested weakly. "Annie." Her mother's voice was firm now. "Why are you making excuses?" The question hung in the air between them. Annie stopped pacing and leaned against the counter, her shoulders sagging. "Because I'm scared," she admitted finally. What if he makes me remember how much I loved it? I can't go back to that life, Mom. We can't afford it." Patricia pushed herself up from the table, moving slowly to stand before her daughter. Though Annie was taller now, she felt small under her mother's gaze. "You gave up everything for me," Patricia said softly. "Your scholarship, your dreams. Every day I watch you work yourself to exhaustion, taking care of me, paying bills, studying for a degree you're not even passionate about." "Mom, let me finish," Patricia interrupted. "You did what you had to do, and I will never stop being grateful. But if this is a chance, even a small one, to get back some of what you lost, you have to take it." Annie felt tears welling up. "And if it's not? If it's just some rich guy's entertainment? Then you'll come home and nothing will have changed," Patricia said simply. "But at least you'll know." They stood in silence for a moment, the early morning light casting long shadows across the kitchen floor. Finally, Annie nodded. "Okay," she whispered. "I'll go." The black dress still fit, though Annie had lost weight in the past year from the stress of work and school. She pulled her hair back into a neat bun, applied minimal makeup, and found a pair of simple flats that wouldn't be out of place in a business setting. Standing before the mirror, she hardly recognized herself. The waitress uniform and ponytail had become such a part of her identity that seeing herself dressed up felt strange, like looking at an alternate version of herself, the version who might have become a concert pianist. "You look beautiful," Patricia said from the doorway. Annie gave her a nervous smile. I feel like I'm playing dress-up. No, her mother said firmly. You're just remembering who you are. The bus ride downtown seemed to take forever. Annie clutched her small purse, rehearsing what she would say when she arrived. Should she be formal, casual? Should she mention the tip he'd promised? The thought made her blush with embarrassment. Reed Tower rose 40 stories above the street, its glass facade reflecting the morning sun. Annie stood on the sidewalk, craning her neck to see the top, her stomach churning with nerves. People in business attire streamed past her, entering the revolving doors with purpose and confidence. You can do this, she whispered to herself, then straightened her shoulders and walked inside. The lobby was all marble and glass, with a security desk and turnstiles blocking access to the elevators. Annie approached the desk hesitantly. I have an appointment with Alexander Reed, she said, trying to keep her voice steady. My name is Annie Jensen. The security guard checked his computer, then looked up with a smile. Yes, Ms. Jensen. Mr. Reed is expecting you on the 38th floor. You'll need this. He handed her a visitor's badge. The elevator shot upward so quickly that Annie's ears popped. When the doors opened on the 38th floor, she stepped into a reception area that was surprisingly understated. Clean lines, neutral colors, and large windows offering a spectacular view of the city. A woman seated at the reception desk looked up with a professional smile. Ms. Jensen, Mr. Reed is ready for you. She stood and led Annie down a hallway to a corner office. Alexander Reed was standing by the window when Annie entered, gazing out at the city below. He turned as the door closed behind her, his expression unreadable. You came, he said, sounding genuinely pleased. I wasn't sure you would. Annie clutched her purse strap tightly. I almost didn't, Reed gestured to a chair. Please sit down. The office was large but not ostentatious. A desk with a computer, a few chairs, bookshelves lined with technical manuals and biographies. The only personal touches were a chess set in the corner and a framed photo that Annie couldn't quite see from where she sat. I promised you a tip last night, Reed said, sitting across from her. I'm a man of my word. He slid an envelope across the desk. Annie didn't touch it. Is that why you asked me here? To give me money? Reed leaned back in his chair, studying her. No, the money is yours regardless. You earned it with that performance. I asked you here because I'd like to make you an offer. What kind of offer? Annie asked cautiously. A second chance, Reed said simply. I'd like to sponsor your return to music school. Annie blinked, certain she had misheard. I'm sorry, what? Full tuition. Living expenses. The best instructors. A proper piano for your home. Reed listed these things as if reading off a grocery list. And a stipend for your mother's care so you won't have to work while studying. Annie felt dizzy, the room seeming to tilt around her. Why would you do that? You don't even know me. Reed was silent for a moment, his eyes distant. Then he stood and walked to the framed photo on his desk, picking it up and bringing it to her. The photo showed a young girl, perhaps 12 years old, sitting at a piano, her face alight with joy. Annie looked up at Reed, confused. My daughter, he said quietly. She loved the piano more than anything. She was going to apply to Juilliard. The past tense hung in the air between them. Annie didn't need to ask what had happened. The grief in his eyes told her enough. I'm sorry, she said softly. Reed returned the photo to his desk. When I saw you looking at that piano in the restaurant last week, I recognized that same longing. And when you played last night, he paused. Music like that shouldn't be lost to the world because of financial circumstances. Annie sat in stunned silence, trying to process what she was hearing. A full scholarship. No more double shifts. No more choosing between textbooks and her mother's medications. What's the catch? She asked finally. There has to be one. Reed smiled slightly. Smart question. Here it is. In 1 year, you'll perform a recital. If your instructors agree that you have the potential for a professional career, the sponsorship continues. If not, it ends, though you keep whatever education you've received up to that point. It sounded too good to be true. Annie searched for the hidden angle, the thing he wasn't saying. And what do you get out of this? The satisfaction of seeing talent recognized, Reed said. Then more softly, and the chance to do for someone else what I couldn't do for my daughter. Annie stood abruptly, walking to the window. Below, the city continued its morning rhythm, people rushing to work, Buses moving along crowded streets, her old life continuing without her. "I need time to think," she said finally. "This is a lot," Reed nodded. "Of course. Take the weekend. My number is in the envelope." He hesitated, then added, "For what it's worth, talent like yours comes along rarely. It would be a shame to let it go to waste." Annie picked up the envelope, her hand trembling slightly. "Thank you for the opportunity, Mr. Reed. I'll let you know by Monday." The ride home was a blur. Annie clutched the envelope but couldn't bring herself to open it. Her mind raced with possibilities. Returning to music school, playing concerts again, not having to worry about money for the first time in years. But with those dreams came fear. What if she failed? What if she wasn't good enough anymore? What if this was just a rich man's whim and he changed his mind halfway through? As she opened the door to their small apartment, her mother looked up expectantly from her chair. "Well?" Patricia asked. Annie sank onto the couch, finally opening the envelope. Inside was a check with more zeros than she had ever seen, along with a business card with a private number scrawled on the back. "He wants to send me back to music school," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Full scholarship. Everything paid for." Patricia's eyes filled with tears. "Oh, Annie, that's wonderful. But what about you? What about our plans?" Annie asked. "I was going to finish my teaching degree, get a steady job with benefits." "Plans change," her mother said gently. "Sometimes for the better." Annie stared at the check in her hand, at the future it represented. "I don't know what to do." Patricia reached over and took her daughter's hand. "Yes, you do. You've always known." In that moment, sitting in their small living room with sunlight streaming through the faded curtains, Annie realized her mother was right. The decision had already been made last night. The moment her fingers had touched those piano keys again, all that remained was finding the courage to admit it. 6 months had passed since that life-changing morning in Alexander Reed's office. Annie stood in the practice room of the Thompson School of Music, her fingers dancing over the keys of a Steinway grand piano that cost more than her mother's medical bills for the past 5 years. "Again," said Professor Chen, tapping his pencil against the music stand. "The emotion is there, but you're rushing the middle section. Let the notes breathe." Annie nodded, positioning her hands once more. This was her 3rd hour of practice today, and her fingers were beginning to ache, but she welcomed the familiar pain. It meant she was working, growing, becoming the musician she had once dreamed of being. She began the piece again, Chopin's Ballad No. 1 in G minor, a challenging composition that had once been beyond her abilities. Now, under Professor Chen's guidance, she was mastering it note by note. As she played, she thought about how much had changed. The day after meeting Reed, she had called the number on his card and accepted his offer. Within a week, she had withdrawn from her community college classes and enrolled at Thompson, one of the most prestigious music schools in the country. Within 2 weeks, a new piano had been delivered to their apartment, causing quite a stir among the neighbors. And within a month, her mother had begun seeing specialists who offered treatments they couldn't have afforded before. "Better," Professor Chen nodded as she finished. "You're making progress, but I still feel hesitation in your playing, especially in the difficult passages. What are you afraid of?" Annie wiped her hands on her jeans, considering the question. "Failing, I guess. Disappointing everyone who's invested in me." The professor closed his sheet music. "You're not playing for them. You're playing for yourself." He checked his watch. "That's enough for today. Practice the troublesome sections slowly tonight, then put it aside. Your mind needs rest as much as your fingers." After he left, Annie remained at the piano, playing softly, letting her thoughts wander. In 6 more months, she would give the recital that Reed had stipulated, the performance that would determine whether his sponsorship continued. The pressure was immense, but so was her determination. Her phone buzzed with a text from her mother. "Don't forget dinner at 7, bringing that spinach pasta you like." Annie smiled. Another change. Her mother was cooking again, something she hadn't been able to do for years due to her condition. The new treatments weren't a cure, but they had improved Patricia's quality of life significantly. She now had the energy to pursue her own interests again, including her love of cooking. As Annie gathered her music and prepared to leave, another text came through. This one from Reed's assistant. "Mr. Reed requests your presence at his home this Saturday at 2 p.m. Car will pick you up. Formal attire." Annie stared at the message in surprise. Since starting at Thompson, She had met with Reed only twice, once when he came to hear her play during her first month, and once for a brief lunch when he had asked about her progress. Both meetings had been cordial but somewhat distant. He had kept his promise of financial support but hadn't tried to insert himself into her education. What could he want now? Saturday arrived with clear skies and a nervous flutter in Annie's stomach. She wore the same black dress from their first meeting, now accessorized with a simple silver necklace, a gift from her mother to celebrate her first successful semester at Thompson. The car that picked her up was sleek and expensive, with a driver who called her Ms. Jensen and didn't attempt small talk during the drive. They left the city behind, heading north along the lake shore, eventually turning onto a private road that led to a modern mansion overlooking Lake Michigan. Annie had expected something ostentatious, but Reed's home was surprisingly modest for a billionaire, large but not grandiose, with clean architectural lines and huge windows that made the most of the spectacular view. A housekeeper greeted her at the door. "Mr. Reed is on the terrace. Please follow me." As she was led through the house, Annie caught glimpses of tasteful furnishings, walls lined with bookshelves, and very few personal items. It felt more like a museum than a home, beautiful but oddly empty. The terrace extended along the back of the house, providing an uninterrupted view of the lake. Reed stood at the railing, watching the waves crash against the rocky shore below. He turned as Annie approached, and she was struck by how tired he looked, as if he hadn't been sleeping well. "Annie," he greeted her with a small smile. "Thank you for coming. Please sit." They sat at a table where tea had been set out. For a few minutes they exchanged pleasantries about the weather, her studies, her mother's health. Then Reed set down his cup and looked at her directly. "I've been hearing good things about your progress," he said. "Professor Chen speaks very highly of your talent." Annie felt a flush of pride. "He's an excellent teacher." "I've learned so much already." Reed nodded. "The reason I asked you here today is because I'm hosting a charity gala next weekend. It's for a foundation that provides musical education to underprivileged children." He paused. "I'd like you to perform." Annie nearly choked on her tea. "Perform? At the gala?" "A short program, 20 minutes at most. Something to show the donors what their money can achieve when they invest in young talent." The thought of playing for a room full of wealthy donors made Annie's palms sweat. "I'm not sure I'm ready for that kind of audience yet. My recital isn't for another 6 months." "This isn't a test," Reed assured her. "Think of it as a practice run. The guests will be impressed no matter what you play. Most of them can't tell Chopin from Beethoven anyway." A hint of a smile crossed his face. Annie took a deep breath. "What would I play?" "Whatever you feel comfortable with," Reed said. "Though if you're asking for suggestions, I always found that Debussy piece you played at the restaurant quite moving." She thought about it for a long moment. Playing Claire de Lune again, this time not as a surprised waitress but as a serious student. There was a certain symmetry to it that appealed to her. "All right," she said finally. "I'll do it." Relief crossed Reed's face. "Excellent. The gala is at the Lakeside Hotel. Formal dress, of course. I'll have something sent for you." He hesitated. "And your mother is welcome to attend as well." As the housekeeper showed her out, Annie passed by a half-open door. Through it, she glimpsed a room that looked different from the rest of the house, warmer, more lived in. At its center stood a baby grand piano, sheet music still open on the stand. She didn't need to ask whose room it had been. The week flew by in a blur of preparations. Annie practiced harder than ever, determined to prove worthy of Reed's confidence. Professor Chen helped her select additional pieces to accompany Claire de Lune, creating a short program that showcased her range and technical ability. The night of the gala arrived all too quickly. Annie stood backstage at the hotel ballroom, peeking through the curtains at the gathering crowd. Men in tuxedos and women in evening gowns mingled, champagne glasses in hand. Her mother sat at a reserved table near the front, looking elegant in a borrowed dress, chatting comfortably with a silver-haired woman who turned out to be Professor Chen's wife. Nervous? Reed had appeared beside her, immaculate in a tuxedo. Terrified, Annie admitted. There must be 200 people out there. 217 to be exact, Reed said. But remember, they're not here to judge you. They're here to be inspired. Annie smoothed down the midnight blue gown that had been delivered to her apartment 2 days ago. It fit perfectly, making her look like someone who belonged in this world of wealth and privilege. But inside she still felt like the waitress from Bellini's, out of place and unsure. "What if I mess up?" she whispered. Reed studied her for a moment. "Do you know why I chose you, Annie? Out of all the struggling musicians in Chicago?" She shook her head. "Because when you play, you forget to be afraid," he said simply. "I saw it that night at the restaurant. Once your fingers touched those keys, nothing else mattered. Not the audience, not your doubts, just the music." Before she could respond, the hotel manager approached. "Mr. Reed, we're ready for you to introduce our performer." Reed gave Annie's shoulder a reassuring squeeze. "Just play like you did that night and you'll be fine." As he walked onto the stage to polite applause, Annie closed her eyes and took deep breaths. She thought about how far she had come, from serving drinks to wealthy patrons to preparing to play for them as an equal. She heard Reed speaking, his voice carrying easily through the ballroom. A remarkable young talent who reminds us all why this foundation's work is so important. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Annie Jensen." Applause filled the room as Annie walked to the piano. The spotlight was warm on her skin, the silence expectant as she adjusted the bench, placed her hands on the keys. For a heartbeat, panic threatened to overwhelm her. Then she caught sight of her mother's face in the front row, proud, loving, encouraging, and Reed beside her, watching with that same intense gaze he'd had the first time he saw her play. Annie began with Claire de Lune, the piece that had started this journey. But this time there was no hesitation, no uncertainty. Her fingers moved with confidence born of months of dedicated practice. The notes flowed like water, filling the ballroom with Debussy's shimmering harmonies. As she played, something magical happened. The nerves fell away, the audience disappeared. Even the grand ballroom faded from her awareness. There was only Annie and the music, speaking to each other in a language more profound than words. She moved seamlessly into her next piece, a Chopin nocturne that Professor Chen had suggested to showcase her emotional range. The music built and receded like the lake waves she had watched from Reed's terrace, carrying the listeners on its current. When she finished her program with a technically challenging listitude, the final note hung in the air for a breathless moment before the room erupted in applause. Annie rose from the bench, flushed with exhilaration, and took a bow as the audience stood. From the front row, her mother wiped away tears. Beside her, Reed remained seated, his expression unreadable. But as Annie took a second bow, she saw something in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Not just satisfaction or pride in his investment, but a kind of peace. In that moment, playing under the bright lights to a room full of strangers who now looked at her with admiration instead of indifference, Annie finally understood what Reed had given her. Not just money or opportunity, but the chance to become herself again. And that was worth more than all the applause in the world. The applause from the gala performance lingered in Annie's mind for days, like the resonance of a perfectly struck chord. Word of her performance spread quickly through Chicago's musical circles. Professor Chen's phone rang constantly with colleagues asking about his remarkable new student, and the dean of Thompson School personally congratulated Annie after her next lesson. But the most surprising outcome arrived 3 days after the gala, an invitation to audition for the Chicago Symphony Orchestra's Young Artist Program, a prestigious opportunity normally reserved for musicians with far more formal training than Annie had received. They were there, Reed explained when she called to ask if he'd had something to do with it. The program director and 2 board members. "I didn't need to say anything. Your playing spoke for itself." Annie sat on the edge of her bed staring at the formal letter. "I never thought something like this would happen so soon." "You've put in the work," Reed said simply. This is just the beginning. He was right. The gala performance had opened doors Annie hadn't even known existed. She found herself with offers to perform at smaller private events, opportunities to collaborate with other students on chamber music programs, and even an interview with a local arts magazine about her unusual journey. Through it all, she remained focused on her ultimate goal, the recital that would determine the continuation of Reed's sponsorship. 6 more months of intensive study, 6 more months to prove that his investment in her had been worthwhile. Winter melted into spring, and Annie's life fell into a new rhythm. Mornings at the piano, afternoons in music theory and history classes, evenings practicing until her fingers ached. Her mother continued to improve with the specialized medical care they could now afford. even joining a book club and rekindling old friendships that her illness had forced her to abandon. Reed remained a distant but constant presence, checking in monthly on her progress, attending the occasional performance, but never interfering with her education. It was as if he instinctively understood that while his financial support was crucial, her artistic development needed to be her own. One evening in late May, as Annie practiced in the living room of their apartment, now a much nicer place in a safer neighborhood, her mother appeared in the doorway. "You've been at that piano for 6 hours," Patricia said gently. "Even your fingers need a break." Annie stretched, wincing at the stiffness in her shoulders. "The recital's only a month away. I need to be perfect." Patricia sat beside her on the bench. "Why do you think Mr. Reed is doing all this?" The question caught Annie off guard. "For his daughter, I guess. To honor her memory." "I think it's more than that," Patricia said thoughtfully. "I've watched him at your performances. He's not just seeing his daughter when you play, he's seeing you." Annie considered this. "What do you mean?" "He's seeing someone get a second chance," Patricia said. "And I think that means more to him than you realize." The next morning, Annie made an impulsive decision. Instead of going to her usual practice room at Thompson, she drove to Bellini's. The restaurant was closed at this hour, but she knew the owner would be there preparing for lunch service. He greeted her warmly, clearly pleased to see his former employee doing so well. "What brings you back to our humble establishment?" he asked with a smile. "The piano," Annie said simply. "I was hoping I could play it again." "For old time's sake," he gestured grandly toward the instrument. "It's yours for as long as you want. Though I warn you, it hasn't been tuned since you left." Annie sat at the familiar bench, running her fingers over keys that were indeed slightly out of tune. But there was something comforting about this piano. Less perfect than the Steinway she now practiced on daily, but full of meaning. This was where it had all begun. She played Claire de Lune again, smiling at how different it felt now, how much more control she had, how much more nuance she could bring to the piece. When she finished, she looked up to find the owner watching her with misty eyes. "You found your way back," he said softly. Annie nodded. "I did, thanks to a challenge I almost didn't accept." That evening, she called Reed. "I'd like to add something to my recital program," she said when he answered. "Something that's not on the approved list from Professor Chen." There was a pause. "What did you have in mind?" "I'm composing a piece," she said, the words coming out in a rush. "About second chances. About finding your way back to something you thought you'd lost forever." Another pause, longer this time. "I think that would be appropriate," Reed finally said, his voice slightly rough. "I look forward to hearing it." The days flew by, filled with a new creative energy as Annie worked on her composition between practice sessions for her classical repertoire. Professor Chen was skeptical at first, but soon became an enthusiastic supporter, offering guidance on structure and notation while encouraging her to maintain her unique voice. The night before her recital, Annie couldn't sleep. She stood by the window of their apartment, looking out at the city lights, thinking about how much had changed in 1 year, from waitress to concert pianist in training, from barely making ends meet to studying at one of the best music schools in the country. Her phone buzzed with a text from Reed. "Whatever happens tomorrow, remember why you play." The recital hall at Thompson was filled to capacity the next day. Students, faculty, music critics, and even some of Annie's former regulars from Bellini's had come to hear her play. Her mother sat in the front row alongside Professor Chen and his wife. Reed had chosen a seat further back, almost hidden in shadow. The stage was set simply, just a grand piano and a pool of light. Annie walked out in a blue gown similar to the one she'd worn at the gala, but this time there was no nervousness, no fear of failure. Whatever happened today, she had already won by finding her way back to music. Her program began with Bach, moved through Chopin, and included challenging pieces by Liszt and Rachmaninoff. With each piece, she demonstrated not just technical skill, but a deep emotional connection to the music, the quality that had caught Reed's attention that first night at Bellini's. For her final piece, she took a moment to address the audience. "This is a new composition," she said simply. "It's called Finding Home, and it's dedicated to 2 people who helped me find mine again." The piece began softly, with a simple melody that echoed her early days at the piano, the joy of a child discovering music for the first time. Then came complications, dissonance, the melody fragmented and almost lost amidst darker harmonies, her years away from music, struggling just to survive. Gradually, the original theme returned, first hesitantly, then with growing confidence, weaving through new variations that spoke of growth and change. The piece concluded not with a grand flourish but with a quiet resolution, the melody finding its way home in a different form, changed but whole again. As the final notes faded, there was a moment of complete silence. Then applause erupted, building until the entire hall was on its feet. Annie stood and bowed, her eyes seeking out her mother, who was openly weeping, and then Reed, who remained seated, his expression hidden in the shadows. The formal evaluation came a week later, unanimous agreement from her professors that Annie showed exceptional promise and should continue her studies. Reed's sponsorship would continue through graduation and beyond if needed. But it was the private meeting with Reed afterward that meant the most to Annie. They sat in his office, high above the city, much as they had a year ago. The committee was very impressed, Reed said, his usual businesslike tone in place. They particularly noted your emotional maturity as a performer. Thank you for giving me this opportunity, Annie said. I know why you did it initially, fine, for your daughter. But I hope you know how much it's meant to me personally. Reed was quiet for a moment, looking out at the city. My daughter loved music because it made her happy, he said finally. Seeing you play, seeing you find that happiness again, has meant more to me than I expected. He turned back to her, and for the first time Annie saw real emotion in his eyes. Your composition, it was beautiful. And very accurate. I've been finding my way home to music, Annie said softly, but I think maybe you've been finding your way too. Reed nodded, a small smile touching his lips. Perhaps we both have. 3 years later, Annie gave her debut performance as a featured soloist with the Chicago Symphony Orchestra. The program included her expanded composition, now titled Second Chances, which had won a prestigious award for new classical music. In the front row sat her mother, healthy enough now to travel and see her daughter perform in concert halls across the country. Beside her was Professor Chen, beaming with pride at his most accomplished student. And in the third row, center seat, his preferred location for optimal acoustics, sat Alexander Reed, the man who had challenged a waitress to play piano and changed both their lives in the process. As the conductor introduced her, Annie looked out at the packed concert hall, so different from that night at Bellini's when she had reluctantly approached the dusty piano in the corner. She caught Reed's eye and gave him a small nod of thanks. Then she placed her hands on the keys and began to play, her music telling the story of loss and rediscovery, of second chances and finding home. And somewhere in the music was the echo of that moment when a whole room had gasped in wonder at the unexpected talent of a waitress who had nearly left her gift behind.